Hi there, John Wilkinson and History Made Easier. In looking at the consequences of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression that followed it, there are two ways in which we can go about this. In the social sciences, we talk about qualitative data and quantitative data. Quantitative is what we can count. Qualitative is less easy to measure. Now, there's a lot that we can count in the consequences to the Great Depression, and I've got a whole heap of stats here for you. If we begin with unemployment, we had 1.6 million Americans unemployed, or 3.2% of the working population in 1929 when the crash occurred. That rose to somewhere between 13 and 14 million, or just short of 25% of the working population. This is in 1933. And even in 1939, there were still 9.5 million Americans unemployed, or 17.2% of the population. High figures, very, very high figures. And there were, of course, cities with an even higher percentage of those eligible for work unemployed. We can look at production rates. 45% drop in production rates between 1929 and 1932, the peak of the Depression. But if we look at specific industries, at one point car production was down by 80%, construction down by as much as 90%. Absolutely huge figures. Businesses, something like 100,000 businesses closed, from factories to shops and restaurants and the like. If we take farms, more than 3 million farmers closed up, bankrupted. Banks, 11,000 banks went bankrupt. And this was somewhere over 40% of all American banks. So these quantitative statistics do tell a tale. They do show the depth of the Depression. But there's another way of looking at this, and that's with qualitative data. And this affects the quality of life. Immediately, goods would be returned. Goods bought on hire purchase would be returned. Or if they were already owned by the people who had bought them, they'd be up for sale. And you wouldn't get a good price for them. Mortgages foreclosed. And that meant many American families were forced into living with relatives. And they were the lucky ones. Many found themselves homeless. Rent, similarly, couldn't be paid. And so again, families forced into living with relatives or left homeless. Now think of the psychological impact on that for fathers, mothers, and for the children as well. Immense, but can't be measured so easily. And there was no welfare state in America, and so there was reliance on emergency relief. But as more and more people were made unemployed, there were less people paying taxes, and so less money for states to provide emergency relief. Living with relations puts a strain on everyone, and marriages suffered as a result. Many husbands left their families temporarily in order to go off and look for work. But as I say, many marriages were put under incredible strain. Just think about, things like loss of sleep for worrying, the arguments over silly little things. It must have been awful. And so I think when you're measuring, when you're dealing with a question that asks you to consider the consequences of the crash, think of the qualitative data as well as the quantitative data. Think of the terrible strain put on people. The ill health, there's another factor. I know we talk of suicides as millions were lost on Wall Street, but really that wasn't even the tip of the iceberg. The real tragedy was in the everyday lives as people tried to pick up the pieces or hang in there until things eventually got better. So, quantitative and qualitative data, they're both very important. And it gives me a chance to remind us all that history is always about people. So I hope that was useful for you. As always, I thank you for listening. And as always, I give you that little reminder to check out my History Made Easier website. Cheers.